No matter how much you know about human beings, reading Eric Harris's writings will disturb you. And Harris is Cain, you know. He says it straightforwardly. He hates human beings. He hates being itself. He would destroy everything if it was within his power to do that. And of course, him and his colleague were motivated to produce far more carnage than they managed that day. What was successful was only a fraction of what they had planned. And Harris said very straightforwardly that he had set himself up as the judge of being and that it lacked all utility in his eyes. Human beings, certainly, should all be removed from the face of existence because of their pathology and the fundamental horrors of being itself. So there's nothing in the Cain and Abel story that isn't real. It's real, and Cain complains to God, as people will when their dreams are dashed. And that goes for people who don't believe in God too. It doesn't really matter, you know. It's harder, I suppose, if you're atheistic to figure out who to blame. But that doesn't mean that the sentiment, well, it doesn't mean that the sentiment is any different, right? The same drama is being enacted. You shake your fist at the structure of being rather than at God himself, but it doesn't make any difference except in the details. So God responds to Cain and tells him that he's got no right to judge being before he gets his sacrificial house in order. And even worse, he says that Cain is the architect of his own downfall, and the invited catastrophe in into his own house willingly, and entered into a creative union with it, and therefore brought about his own demise. And it's that additional self-knowledge, and you can imagine too, you know, imagine that you're facing your life, you're facing the failures of your life, and let's say that you've had a failed life, and you're bitter about that, and then you meditate upon it, and you think, well, why has this come about? And then you think, well, perhaps I did something wrong. You know, when Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote the Gulag Archipelago, which is the book that detailed the catastrophes of the Soviet Union and helped bring it down, there's one part of that book that just struck me so viciously when I read it. He was in the Gulag, and he was there for a very long time, and he said that he observed a variety of people in the camps who he really admired. They were rare. They were usually religious believers in his experience, who were not participating in the pathology of the camps at all, period, no matter what. He said he learned a lot from watching those people. He had a hard time believing that they even existed, that they could even exist. But he said that one of the things that he was brought to as a consequence of watching those people live their contract with goodness out, even under the most horrifying of conditions, was that it was possible that he himself was responsible for his position in the camp. Now, it's a very dangerous line of argumentation, you know, because who wants to be the one who blames the victim for the catastrophe? You know, you have to be very careful when you walk down that road. But Solzhenitsyn was speaking about himself. And he said, well, he was a communist, you know, and he arrogantly and forthrightly moved the movement out into the world and had not fully gone over his life with a fine-tooth comb to find out what mistakes he had made that brought him so low. But his contention eventually was that part of the reason that he ended up where he ended up was because he and many others had completely forfeited their relationship with the truth and allowed their society to degenerate into deceit and tyrannical catastrophe without mounting sufficient opposition. And so he decided when he was in the camps to straighten himself out bit by bit, and that culminated in the production of the Gulag Archipelago, and that book really demolished once and for all any moral credibility that the communist totalitarian systems had left. And so one man in the depths of catastrophe, who determined through good example, at least in part, to stop lying, produced a book eventually that demolished the foundation of the very system that had imprisoned him. And that is really worth thinking about. That's one example of the absolute grandeur of the human soul and the capacity for transformation that it has when let loose properly on the world. So let's say you're conceptualizing your own failure, you know, and you meditated on it and you come to the conclusion that God forced Cain to. Hey, not only have things not been going very well for you, but it's actually your fault. And not only that, you brought it on yourself. And not only that, you knew it all the time. Well, then you might think you'll wake up and fly right? You'll get your wings in order and fly right, but there's no reason to assume that at all, and that's not what happens to Cain. That just makes him more bitter, right? And you can understand that if you think about it just for a second. It's like bad enough when something horrible happens to you, but then to have to swallow the additional pill, right? To have to take in the information that you could have done something different. It was avoidable, and you knew it at the time, and you decided to do it anyways. And I think people are in that situation a lot more often than anyone is willing to admit. You know, you have that little voice in the back of your head that says, don't do it. And you override it. And you know it's arrogance that makes you override it. It's always arrogance, you know. It always warns you. It's always arrogance. Yeah, I can get away with it. It's like, no, you can't. I don't think you ever get away with anything. So, and maybe your experience has taught you different, but my suspicions are it hasn't. And if you think it has, well, the other shoe hasn't yet dropped. So Cain doesn't take the opportunity to let God's wisdom reorient his character. And that could have been the outcome. He could have got down on his knees, so to speak, and said, oh my God, I've been wrong all along. I've been living improperly. I've been making the wrong sacrifices. Abel deserves everything he has. I got exactly what was coming to me. You know, could I possibly now straighten myself out and live in repentance and improve my position? But that's not what he did at all. He said, all right, fair enough. I get it. It's like, I'm going to go after the thing I most admire, and I'm going to destroy it. And I'm going to do that despite its cost to me. And I'm going to do that just to spite the creator of being. Well, that's exactly what Harris did at Columbine. It's exactly what he says, in fact, in his uncanny writings. It's why the mass murderers always shoot themselves afterwards, not before. Because you might wonder, if you're so upset with the structure of being, why you don't just commit suicide in your basement? Why do you have to go out and mass murder before you top it off with a gun to your forehead? Well, you don't make the point as effectively if you just commit suicide in your basement. It's like, well, my life means nothing to me, but neither does anyone else's, and neither does the structure of being itself, and I'll take all my revenge as much as I possibly can, and then just to show you how little I care, I'll cap myself off at the end. And I would say also, people say all the time, I don't understand how that could happen. It's like, I don't believe that. I think an hour of thought, of real thought about your darkest feelings about existence itself, illuminates the pathway to that sort of behavior quite clearly. And I think if you, I mean, I might be wrong. Like, I might be a darker person than most, and it's certain. Okay. Well, at least I think there are plenty of people out there who are sufficiently dark to know exactly what I mean when I'm saying these things. And I would also say that if it doesn't leap to your understanding how that pathway might be illuminated, then you need to know a lot more about yourself than you actually know now. Because whatever you might say about someone like Eric Harris, he was a human being too, you know. There's this idea in the New Testament that Christ was he who took the sins of the world unto himself. It's a very complicated idea, but part of it is associated with the idea that he met the devil in the desert as well. To take the sins of mankind onto yourself is to understand that within you dwells exactly the same spirit that commit the atrocities at Columbine or that ran the camps at Auschwitz, and to actually understand that that's part and parcel of your makeup, and then to take responsibility for it. And I think that in the aftermath of the terrible 20th century, that's what we're left with. We're left with the necessity to take responsibility for the most terrible aspects of ourselves. And that way, perhaps we can stop those terrible things from happening again. That's all. One of the things Jung said about the shadow, and this is, I would say, one of the primary impediments to enlightenment, is that if you start looking at your motives for misbehaving, and I mean by that something very specific. I don't mean that you're misbehaving by someone else's standards. I don't mean that. I mean, when you know by your own standards that you're doing something that's devious or malevolent or underhanded, you know it, and you still do it. So it's your own judgment you're bringing to bear on yourself. If you look at why you're doing that, the longer you look at it, the deeper a hole you dig. And so this is the motif of Dante's Inferno, fundamentally. So Dante's Inferno is a story about, I can't remember his name, unfortunately. Might be Dante, in fact, although I don't remember. He's led into hell by Virgil, who's an ancient philosopher, thinker. And hell has levels, and so the outer level is, and this is a Christianized version of hell, because there's hells of all sorts, but this is a Christianized version. And so on the outermost levels of hell, which is sort of like normal life, are the ancient philosophers, and they're still in hell because they weren't Christian, but it's kind of like, it's like cheap motel hell instead of the full pit thing, you know. And so then Dante goes deeper and deeper into hell until he gets right to the bottom of it. And it's been a while since I read it, but if I remember correctly, Satan himself is encased in ice at the bottom of hell, surrounded by people who betray others. And so Dante's notion was that the worst of all possible violations of moral behavior was betrayal, and that they're in the deepest levels of hell. And I really like that idea. I think it's true, because if you trust me, then you're manifesting the necessary courage that puts someone through life. You know, if you're smart, you don't trust me because you're naive. You trust me knowing that I'm full of snakes and so are you, but maybe we could cooperate and move things along nicely, you know, and we could reduce each other to the word, to our word, and we could cooperate. But you're awake, you know, and then I betray that, then I'm undermining your necessary faith in life and humanity. And you can really hurt someone that way. Like sometimes it's self-betrayal, but you can really do someone in that. We can really traumatize them. So that they can't recover. And so it's a really terrible thing to do to someone. And maybe it's the worst thing, and that was Dante's idea. And it's tied in. That makes very interesting reading if you read it at the same time as Milton's Paradise Lost, because those are metaphysical explorations. This is what they are. They're metaphysical explorations of the terrible places you can end up, and that people do end up, and also a metaphysical explanation of what spirit takes you there. So, because you might ask, well, why do you betray someone? And that is a deep question. And so you'll have your specific reasons, but under that there'll be some other reasons, and under that there'll be some other reasons, and under that there'll be some other reasons. And if you go all the way to the bottom, you come up with the ultimate reasons why you betrayed someone. And when you look at that, that will not be pretty. That's when your proclivity for evil, let's say, unites with the general human proclivity for evil, and you discover just exactly what you're capable of. And so Jung's notion was that, well, that was a full encounter with the shadow, which is, I suppose, partly what this course is about, because one of the things that I believe I told you at the beginning was that I was going to try to help you understand how it might be that you could be an Auschwitz guard. And to really understand that, that's a horrifying thing to understand. But I'll tell you, if you want to grow some teeth, that's a really good thing to understand. So we were talking about your capacity to negotiate before. Like, if you aren't a monster, you cannot negotiate. But if you've got that under control, then you don't have to be a monster. It's really paradoxical. So if you're just naive, well, you end up in jail and a marionette master has control over you. That's not helpful. So that's not good. That just means you're useless and you can be manipulated. You won't go out of your way to be malevolent, but it's mostly because you just don't have the skills, the organizational skills, or even the depth to do that. You know, you're good because you're harmless. That's not good. That's easily manipulated. And so you think, well, how do you get out of that? Well, partly you watch people because you know what they're like, because you know what you're like, and that, but you also know what you could do and would do if you were pushed. And so you don't have to show much of that when you're negotiating with someone for them to take you really seriously. So it's a strange thing, you know, but one of the things Jung pointed out too was that what you most need to know will be found where you least want to look. And that's because you haven't already looked there. And so it's a little different for everyone, right? Because your particular place you don't want to look isn't going to be the same as your place. But you're going to have a place you don't want to look. And what you haven't discovered, that's where it is. And so that's all partly going to be discovered by you looking at what you're capable of, what you're truly capable of. We are the most complicated things there are that we know of by a massive amount. We're so complicated that it's unbelievable. And so, you know, there's a lot of cosmos out there, but there's a lot of cosmos in here too. And which one is greater is by no means obvious unless you use something trivial like relative size, which, you know, really isn't a very sophisticated approach. And whatever it is that is you has this capacity to experience reality and to transform it, which is a very strange thing, you know. You can conceptualize a future in your imagination, and then you can work and make that manifest. You participate in the process of creation. That's one way of thinking about it. And so that's why I think in Genesis 1, it relates the idea that human beings are made in the image of the divine, men and women, which is interesting too, because, you know, the feminists are always criticizing Christianity, for example, as being, inexorably patriarchal. Of course, they criticize everything like that, so it's hardly a stroke of bloody brilliance. But I think it's an absolute miracle that right at the beginning of the document, it says straightforwardly, like with no hesitation whatsoever, that the divine spark, which we're associating with the word that brings forth being, is manifest in men and women equally. That's a very cool thing. And you got to think, well, like I said, you actually take that seriously. Well, what you got to ask is, what happens if you don't take it seriously? Right? Read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. That's the best investigation of that tactic that's ever been produced. Because what happens in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is that the main character, whose name is Raskolnikov, decides that there's no intrinsic value to other people. And that as a consequence, he can do whatever he wants. It's only cowardice that stops him from acting, right? Because why would it be anything else if the value of other people is just an arbitrary superstition? Then why can't I do exactly what I want when I want? Which is the psychopath's viewpoint. Well, so Raskolnikov does. He kills someone who's a very horrible person, and he has very good reasons for killing her. And he's half-starved and a little bit insane and possessed by this ideology. It's brilliant, brilliant layout. And he finds out something after he kills her, which is that the post-killing Raskolnikov and the pre-killing Raskolnikov are not the same person even a little bit. Because he's broken a rule, like he's broken a serious rule, and there's no going back. And Crime and Punishment is the best investigation I know of what happens if you take the notion that there's nothing divine about the individual seriously. Now, you know, most of the people I know who are deeply atheistic, and I understand why they're deeply atheistic, they haven't contended with people like Dostoevsky, not as far as I can tell. Because I don't see logical flaws in Crime and Punishment. I think he got the psychology exactly right. And Dostoevsky's amazing for this, because in one of his books, The Devils, for example, he describes a political scenario that's not much different than the one we find ourselves in now. And there are these people who are possessed by rationalistic, utopian, atheistic ideas. And they're very powerful. They give rise to the communist revolution, right? I mean, they're powerful ideas. And his character, Stavrogan, also acts out the presupposition that human beings have no intrinsic nature and no intrinsic value. And it's another brilliant investigation, and Dostoevsky prophesies, that's what I would say, what will happen to a society if it goes down that road? And he was dead exactly accurate. It's uncanny to read Dostoevsky's The Possessed or The Devils, depending on the translation, and then to read Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, because one is fiction and prophecy, and the second is, hey, look, it turned out exactly the way that Dostoevsky said it would for exactly the same reasons. So it's quite remarkable. So the question is, do you contend seriously with the idea that A, there's something cosmically constitutive about consciousness, and B, that might well be considered divine, and C, that is instantiated in every person? And then ask yourself if you're not a criminal if you don't act it out. and then ask yourself what that means. Is that reflective of a reality? Is it a metaphor? Like maybe it's a metaphor, a complex metaphor that we have to use to organize our societies. Could well be, but even as a metaphor, it's true enough so that we mess with it at our peril. And it also took people a very long time to figure out.
What do you think, behaviorally speaking, humans primarily are? That is, do you think we have a sort of Hobbesian human nature or plastic human nature or something else? Because this seems to, when you hear either conservatives or liberals or people on the far right or far left discuss what kind of policies and what kind of economics and what we should have, how we should deal with the rest of the world, it usually often comes back, at least to justify their opinions, it always comes back to, well, this is what humans are, and this is therefore more natural for us to do A, have a capitalist society, or B, have a socialist society. What do you think is the basic human nature or do you think that we have a basic human nature?
I believe that we are part of the natural world, okay? Mm-hmm. Therefore, we have a nature. It's our genetic endowment determines substantially what our nature is. In fact, if you look at the growth of any organism, us, bees, yeast, whatever you like, there are actually three factors that enter into its growth and development. One is its genetic constitution, another is environmental effects, and a third is just the way laws of nature work, which turns out is a major effect. And the inquiry into biological organisms takes all of those into account, or should. As for our the human nature, the genetic endowment that we essentially share, very little is known about it. I mean, it's just a really hard question. And as I mentioned in our earlier discussion, a lot of the ways of studying it are excluded, simply because we don't allow invasive experimentation. Mm. It's hard enough to learn about insect nature, where we allow ourselves anything, and they're much simpler organisms. So what do we know about human nature? Well, most of our knowledge comes from history, experience, literary exploration, and so on. That's what our knowledge comes from. What does it tell us? It tells us that, of course, humans are partially plastic. Like, I don't speak Swahili, for example, so we're partially plastic. On the other hand, there has to be an enormous uniformity at a level right below the surface. And what we see on the surface is a wide range of possibilities. I mean, we see people who are acting in a beastly fashion. We see others who are kind of sacrificing their lives to save dolphins.
One of the sciences, and I'm not sure if it would be categorized the hard science or soft science, or it's an emerging science, evolutionary psychology. People like E.O. Wilson and Steven Pinker have come around and said they understand what human nature is, and it's based on this new science. Are you saying then that they're either still just guessing, or do they have some scientific backing that from what you have, if you've read any of their work?
Yes, I know their work, and I know a lot of them. What's now called evolutionary psychology was in fact initiated about over a century ago, by Peter Kropotkin, the anarchist thinker and naturalist, who wrote a book called Mutual Aid, a Factor in Evolution. Mm-hmm. And in it, he investigated, he was basically trying to counter social Darwinists. He was Darwinist himself, and he argued by looking at a lot of naturalistic phenomena, other animals, human history, and so on. He argued that if you look at it, you discover that mutual aid had provided a selectional advantage, and therefore organisms had evolved through selection, including humans, to be deeply committed to one or another form of mutual aid. Well, that's not what elite opinion wants to hear. They want to hear some other story. So therefore, Kropotkin's form of evolutionary psychology essentially disappeared. Right. It's been revived to some extent. The modern state of evolutionary psychology, it's not that there's no science there at all. There's some, like say kin selection is real, reciprocal altruism is real, a couple other things are real, but very little is known. It's thin. This is not physics, and it's not molecular biology, it's not chemistry. It's largely guesses. It's a worthwhile topic to pursue. You know, I think it's a fine topic to pursue. In fact, that's where my own professional work is in particular areas. But scientists particularly should be very cautious about inducing and deluding the public to think that they know more than they do. Science is held in enormous respect for good reasons, and therefore scientists have a responsibility to make very clear, here's what we know and here's what we don't know. And what we know in these areas happens to be extremely thin, not because they're not good scientists, but because the questions are too hard.
Yeah, is there such a thing as human nature? Or are the groups or the people who deny the possibility of such a thing, which includes a great many Marxists, correct in denying that there's any such thing as human nature?
Well, either there is such a thing as human nature, or humans are angels from another planet or another universe. I mean, any organism that exists in the organic world has a nature. That's what distinguishes it from other organisms. So we're different from insects, we're different from apes, you know, and so on and so forth. And that can either be because we're like other organisms and we have some kind of a nature, or it's because maybe God implanted us in the world or something like that. Those are the two options. Now, you're absolutely right about Marx. People call themselves Marxists. In fact, even well-known Marxists like Gramsci say that there's no nature, human nature, there's just history. If you can find a couple of phrases like that in Marx. They can't have meant what they said. What they probably meant was human nature can take many different exemplifications depending on circumstances, which is of course true. The same is true of insects. But this has become a kind of a slogan. It's considered sort of it's considered that if you, on the left, or what's called the left, that if you deny that there's any human nature, you're in favor of change. If you say there is a human nature, you got to be reactionary, because you're saying, you know, people have to be rotten and have slaves and so on. There's nothing like that. In fact, if you take a look at Marx, who they pay fealty to, he was a dedicated believer in human nature. I mean, in fact, he took most of his ideas right out of the Enlightenment and the Romantic period where he lived. And he carried them over. That's his concept of alienation, for example, and you know, somehow your fundamental nature is a need for creative work under your own control. If it's dominated by others, you get alienated labor. You know, the whole story comes out of that. It's based on a conception of human nature. Is there any evidence for it? Well, let's take the real study. I mean, let's assume we're not angels. Okay, we're organisms. So therefore, there is human nature. Okay, then we try to discover what it is. Well, we do it the way we discover what bee nature is. It's much harder. You know, we're much more complicated organisms, and unlike other organisms, we can't do direct experiments. But if you want to study the parts of human nature that have to do with the issues that matter in human affairs, you can't do anything much in the way of comparative evidence because humans are just different. There isn't much in the way of comparative evidence. Some, but it's pretty thin. And what there is, you know, at an evolutionary distance of 12, 15 million years. It's a long time. Other animals have changed and we've changed. So you just don't get much. I mean, there's some comparative evidence, but not much. Direct experimental evidence, yes, there's some in some areas. Like, take, say, language, where I work. Yeah, there's quite a lot of evidence there, and that it's a unique human property. There's nothing remotely like it in the animal world, as far as we know. But you can learn a lot about it, because it's kind of isolated, and you could separate it from other things. Actually, many of the questions you'd like to ask about language are beyond experiment, the traditional questions. Like, for example, how you and I are doing what we're now doing. How are we able to produce freely new expressions that have maybe new ideas that have never been expressed, and if you say it, I understand it, and so on and so forth. What's sometimes called the creative aspect of language use, which was a big topic, and you know, in the tradition. I mean, Descartes, Rousseau, Humboldt, others, but we don't know. We can't study that. We can study the mechanisms that enter into it, but not much about the. As soon as you get to choice and decision and so on, you're kind of at sea. But there are a lot of topics you can study. There are many that are beyond what we know how to study, but there's got to be a nature. Otherwise, we're kind of like either we're angels or kind of like amoebas. You know, anything that happens to us just shapes us, and we become some shapeless form of it.
Otherwise, a baby could grow up to be a penguin.
Yeah, something. Yeah, exactly. I mean, like there's a huge debate about whether there's an innate language faculty. Well, you know, I mean, the answer to that is so trivial that you have to wonder who's asking the question. I mean, like, if, say, my granddaughter and her pet, a chimp or, you know, songbird or whatever, have exactly the same data, how come my granddaughter picks out of the data something that's language related, reflexively, of course, and then, again, reflexively ends up doing what you and I are doing, whereas the other animals don't even take the first step? Well, it's either a miracle or she's got a language faculty. There's no other option. But there's a huge debate about that, even among people called scientists. People are extremely rational about themselves for some reason. But yes, there has to be a human nature. If there wasn't, you know, it's just stuff, it's inconceivable. And we can try to find out what it is. Well, you know, on issues that really matter to us, the sciences don't tell us very much. Let me tell you a little. So, for example, why are people, say, altruistic? Why do you help others? Okay, there's some evidence from biology. Most of it just sort of gives some basis for what you know anyway. So people tend to be more caring for their children than for their cousins, let's say. Okay, you can give a story about kin selection, you know, the genes that get proliferated and so on. It tells you something. I mean, it doesn't tell you why people on Cape Cod go into icy waters and storms to try to rescue stranded dolphins. You know, no kin relation, you know, but they do it, you know. And it doesn't tell you why they spend huge effort in doing that, but don't care about a kid starving across the street, you know. They don't tell you why you take care of your stepchildren, you know, where you know they're stepchildren. I mean, so yeah, it tells you something. And there are some, there's one category, reciprocal altruism, worked on by Robert Trivers, a very good biologist, which actually has some interesting results. You know, you help somebody else, they help you, you know, so on. Most things you just have to rely on what we call intuition, you know, meaning introspection, experience, you know, evidence of history, whatever they may be. And you can get some, you know, not vacuous speculations about what human beings are like.
What's the utility of the view that there is no human nature that causes it to be widespread, particularly on the left?
The utility is that you can convince yourself, if you're sufficiently irrational, that that means we can introduce changes. Incidentally, these views are extremely popular among a segment of the left, the Leninist segment. They may deny it. But these views are useful for people who want to be managers. If there's no human nature, then if I control people, there's no moral barrier to it. Because if there's no human nature anyway, I can determine what they should be, and of course I'm completely benevolent because there's no human nature for other people, there is for me. So I'm benevolent, and I know what's right, and therefore I can kind of help these amoebas to turn into good things instead of bad things. It's a very convenient doctrine for the managerial class.
There are people who will respond to the idea of justice, equity, fairness, people controlling their own lives, and they'll say, oh yeah, it sounds nice, but human nature precludes it. Human nature is such that, and I'm talking about, you know, caring people who will just say, yeah, of course I'd like to live in a better world like that, but it's like asking a tree to fly. It's not possible because there is a human nature, and human nature is such that it precludes the possibility of that kind of situation and yields instead what we see all around us and what we've seen through history. How would you try to talk to counter, to address that kind of view, which is very widespread?
Well, two ways. First, the way you try to evaluate any factual statement. All right, you made a factual claim. Back it up. Do you have scientific basis for it? Do you have evidence for it? Well, you know,
they're going to say, my evidence is all over. I have a history of, well, that's what they're going to say. I have a history of suffering and conflict and
you have a history
denial.
of benevolence and you know, dedication to improving things. Yeah, history tells you all kinds of things. Doesn't tell you what you want. The same history can tell you the opposite if you want. So you're picking out of history certain features which happen to have an interesting consequence. They prevent you from doing anything. They're very self-serving. I mean, if nothing can be changed, then it's fine if you just want to be Ayn Rand or something. But you have no evidence for it. Because if you take a look at history, you just as well find the opposite. You can show in history that Kropotkin was right in saying that mutual aid is a factor in evolution. Yeah, okay, it's as good as the evidence to the contrary. So you take the range of history and experience and so on, and you can pick out something that will justify you in just looking out for number one, or you can take something that would justify you in devoting yourself to the welfare of others. It's your choice, but you can't claim any argument from history. In fact, if you really take arguments from history seriously, you know, we could argue about how seriously you should do it, but there is something noticeable. I mean, there is a tendency throughout history towards more and more commitment to justice, equity, and freedom. And you see it pretty clearly. And we even see it in our own lifetimes. Like take, say, you know, women's rights, rights of minorities, concern over future generations, the environmentalist movement. That was very limited 40 or 50 years ago. Now it's quite broad. You go back further, say, the right to vote, you know, right to associate, the right of freedom of speech, you know. By and large, rights, there has been it is regression, you know, a lot of horrible things, but one pretty noticeable tendency in history is towards more freedom and justice and equity.
But the interesting thing, actually one of the interesting things is when people engage in antisocial behavior, they have to, and routinely do, act as though that's not what they're doing. They cover it with a rationalization. Well, why would you need to do that? If antisocial behavior was actually wired in and part of us, we wouldn't alibi it. We would just say that's what we're doing. I mean, a wolf wouldn't say, I'm eating the sheep because I'm trying to help the sheep. It would just say, I'm eating the sheep because I'm hungry.
That's right.
And the same thing goes for human. No, nobody does that.
Henry Kissinger probably would say it on the Cambodia bombing. But, you know, yeah, that's a good argument. Why do you bother to rationalize?